You ever notice how the loudest men in the room are usually the ones who've never had to prove anything under real pressure? The voice drifted lazily through the officer briefing hall just as another burst of laughter rolled across the room. Rain hammered against the reinforced windows of Falcon Ridge Air Force Base, turning the Colorado runway outside into a river of shimmering lights and distorted reflections. The storm had arrived fast, black clouds swallowing the mountains less than an hour earlier, and now the entire installation sat under emergency weather lockdown. Radar systems flickered. Communication channels crackled with interference. Every aircraft on the flight line had been grounded until further notice. Inside the briefing hall, however, the mood among the younger officers was anything but tense. They stood in clusters beneath the fluorescent lights, trading jokes, sipping stale coffee, and pretending the lockdown was nothing more than an inconvenience delaying their weekend plans. Captain Ethan Cole leaned back against the edge of the conference table with the effortless confidence of a man who had never once doubted his place in the world. 28 years old. Perfect academy record. Flight suit pressed sharp enough to cut paper. He held a steaming paper cup in one hand while gesturing toward the old man seated alone near the back wall. Seriously, Ethan said with a grin, somebody tell me maintenance didn't lose another retiree. A few officers chuckled immediately. One lieutenant nearly spit coffee laughing. The old man didn't react. Walter Hayes sat quietly beneath the dim corner light, one weathered hand resting atop an old olive-drab duffel bag at his feet. He looked painfully ordinary at first glance. Thin frame. Gray hair cut short. Faded denim jacket zipped halfway up against the cold draft humming through the building ventilation. The kind of man most people's eyes passed over without a second thought. But there was something strange about him if you looked longer than a few seconds. His stillness felt deliberate. Not passive. Not confused. Controlled. Like a man perfectly comfortable sitting in silence while chaos unfolded around him. Ethan noticed the silence from the old man and smirked wider. "You hear me, sir," he called out. "Buildings restricted during lockdown unless you've got clearance." More laughter scattered through the room. Outside, thunder rolled across the runway with a deep metallic growl that rattled the glass. Walter slowly lifted his eyes toward the giant weather monitor mounted on the far wall. Green storm bands crawled across the radar map like living veins. His pale blue gaze lingered there for several seconds before he finally spoke. "Your storm track's drifting north." The room quieted for exactly one heartbeat before another officer barked a laugh. "What?" Ethan grinned. "You moonlight as Weather Channel now?" Walter's expression never changed. "Wind shears shifting off the western ridge," he said calmly. "Towers reading old data." One lieutenant rolled his eyes hard enough to make the others laugh again. "Sure thing, Grandpa." Ethan pushed off the table and started walking toward him slowly, boots clicking against the polished floor. "Let me guess," he said, "you flew cargo planes back when cockpit instruments were basically toaster ovens and duct tape." A few officers snorted. Walter remained seated. Rainwater streaked down the windows behind him, casting warped shadows across the room every time lightning flashed overhead. Ethan stopped a few feet away now, looking down at the old man with the casual arrogance of someone completely certain he was the smartest person present. "So what exactly are you doing in here?" Ethan asked. "Maintenance crew lost track of you?" Walter glanced once toward the flight line outside. Even through the rain, rows of grounded aircraft sat motionless beneath the storm lights like sleeping giants. "Waiting," he answered quietly. "Waiting for what?" Ethan asked. Walter's eyes stayed on the runway. The part where everyone realizes the storm's worse than they think. The confidence in Ethan's grin faltered just slightly. Before he could respond, the overhead lights flickered once. Then twice. Somewhere deeper inside the base, an alarm suddenly chirped across the intercom before cutting into static. Several officers exchanged uneasy glances. The radar display on the far wall blinked violently for half a second before stabilizing again. Walter finally looked back toward Ethan. Calm. Unmoved. Almost tired. Then, in a voice so low it barely rose above the hum of the fluorescent lights, he said, "You officers laugh too much before checking your instruments." For a few long seconds, nobody in the briefing hall spoke. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead while rain hammered the runway hard enough to blur the floodlights outside into trembling white smears across the glass. Captain Ethan Cole stared at Walter Hayes with the faint irritation of a man unsure whether he was being mocked or challenged. Then the overhead speakers crackled alive again. "Attention all personnel. Weather advisory has been upgraded to condition red. All non-essential exterior movement is suspended until further notice." The room shifted immediately. Laughter faded. A few officers glanced uneasily toward the giant radar display at the front wall where the storm pattern had visibly changed. The green mass that had been drifting east only minutes earlier was now bending sharply north exactly like Walter had said. One lieutenant frowned. That was not the projected track. Ethan folded his arms tighter. Lucky guess. Walter did not answer. He simply reached down and adjusted the old duffel bag beside his boots before settling back into silence. Ethan hated that silence. The old man carried it too comfortably. Most civilians became nervous around officers. Especially inside a restricted Air Force command building during an emergency lockdown. But Walter Hayes sat there like he belonged more than anyone else in the room. That calmness irritated Ethan more than open disrespect ever could. Another officer walked toward the windows and peered outside. Beyond the soaked runway, maintenance crews hurried beneath flashing amber lights while ground vehicles crawled through the storm like shadows. In the distance, a KC-46 Pegasus tanker sat motionless beneath sheets of rain, its massive tail barely visible through the haze. "Tower just lost uplink with the western radar array," someone muttered near the communications desk. "Backup systems are lagging." Ethan exhaled sharply through his nose. "Fantastic." Walter's eyes lifted slightly. "Your backup generator is going to fail next." Ethan turned back immediately. "Excuse me." Walter looked toward the ceiling vents as though listening to something hidden beneath the noise of the storm. "Power fluctuations are already cycling through the building." One young lieutenant laughed nervously. "What are you, psychic?" Walter ignored him. Ethan stepped closer now, boots thudding across the polished tile. "All right," he said, voice tightening, "I have had just about enough mystery act for one night. You walk into a secured officer briefing hall during a base emergency, start predicting systems failures, and expect nobody to ask questions." Walter finally looked directly at him. His pale blue eyes were steady and unreadable beneath the cold overhead lights. "You asked questions," he said quietly. "You just did not listen to the answers." The remark landed harder than Ethan expected. A couple officers looked away awkwardly. The old man's voice never rose. Never sharpened. But every sentence carried the weight of someone completely unafraid of the room around him. Before Ethan could respond, the lights flickered again. This time the room dimmed long enough for a low murmur to spread among the officers. Somewhere deep in the building, a generator coughed with a metallic groan. Walter slowly leaned back in his chair. There it is. A beat later, half the monitors along the east wall shut off simultaneously. The communications desk erupted with static. "Control tower just lost secondary feed," a technician called out. "We are blind on the north approach." Several officers moved immediately toward the front displays, tension replacing the casual arrogance from earlier. Ethan remained where he stood, jaw tightening slightly as he looked back at Walter. The old man still appeared completely calm. No smugness. No satisfaction. Just patience. Like he had seen this exact kind of panic 100 times before. Ethan suddenly noticed details he had ignored earlier. The old denim jacket was faded almost white around the elbows from decades of wear. Walter's hands were rough and scarred beneath the fluorescent light, the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime working around machinery and weather and metal. Resting beside his chair, the old duffel bag carried faded stitched lettering almost worn beyond recognition. Ethan squinted slightly. United States Air Force. Beneath it, another patch barely visible beneath years of fraying thread. Strategic Air Command. Ethan frowned. Strategic Air Command had been dissolved decades ago. "How old are you exactly?" one lieutenant asked with a half-laugh, trying to recover the room's earlier mood. Walter looked toward the rain-swept runway again before answering. "Old enough to know storms do not care about rank." Thunder rolled low across the mountains outside, deep enough to vibrate through the walls themselves. Then the emergency doors at the far end of the hall burst open as Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks strode inside carrying a soaked flight jacket over one arm. Water dripped onto the floor behind him while cold winds swept briefly through the room. Brooks stopped almost immediately when he spotted Walter sitting quietly near the back wall. His expression changed in an instant. Not confusion. Recognition. Real recognition. The kind that drains color from a man's face before he even understands why. And for the first time all night, somebody in the room looked at Walter Hayes with something far more dangerous than amusement. Respect. The room changed the second Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks stopped moving. Until that moment, the briefing hall had still carried traces of casual arrogance beneath the storm tension. Officers whispered. Someone nervously laughed near the coffee station. Rain hammered the roof in steady violent waves while static hissed through the damaged communication speakers overhead. But Brooks was staring directly at Walter Hayes now, and the look on his face drained the atmosphere right out of the room. Ethan Cole noticed it immediately. "Master Sergeant?" Ethan asked. Brooks did not answer at first. His eyes moved slowly from Walter's face down toward the faded olive drab duffel bag resting beside the chair. Water dripped from Brooks's soaked jacket sleeve onto the tile floor as thunder rolled somewhere beyond the flight line. Walter met his gaze calmly. Neither man spoke for several seconds. It felt strangely heavy. Like two men silently recognizing something nobody else in the room understood yet. Finally Brooks took a slow breath. "Sir," he said quietly. "I did not know you were coming tonight." The entire room froze. Ethan blinked hard. One lieutenant let out a confused laugh. "Wait. You know him?" Brooks ignored the question completely. He stepped closer toward Walter with visible caution, almost like approaching someone important enough to require instinctive respect. Walter gave a faint shrug. Storm came faster than expected. Brooks nodded once. "Yes, sir." Ethan stared openly now. The shift in tone hit him harder than the weather alerts or system failures. A master sergeant with 20 years of service did not speak like that to random civilians sitting in briefing halls. Especially not during an emergency lockdown. Ethan folded his arms tighter. "All right," he said carefully, "what exactly is going on here?" Brooks finally looked toward him. "Captain, perhaps this is not the time." "No," Ethan replied sharply. "Actually this feels exactly like the time." Another nearby monitor flickered violently before stabilizing again. Outside the windows, lightning illuminated rows of grounded aircraft in harsh white flashes. Walter remained seated through all of it, hands folded loosely atop the old duffel bag like the storm and tension around him belonged to another world entirely. Ethan stepped closer again. "You have been predicting system failures for the last 20 minutes, he said. "You are sitting in a secured operations hall during a base emergency, and now a senior master sergeant walks in acting like he just saw a ghost." He tilted his head slightly. "So let me ask directly this time. Who exactly are you?" Walter looked up slowly. The fluorescent lights reflected faintly in his pale blue eyes. "Nobody important anymore." Ethan exhaled sharply through his nose. Right. One of the younger lieutenants chuckled nervously from the side of the room. Maybe he is retired. Intelligence or something. Another officer smirked. Or maybe he used to forecast weather in the 1970s. A few uneasy laughs spread again. Brooks's jaw tightened instantly, but Walter simply sat there unmoved. Ethan leaned one hand against the nearby table. Fine, he said. You want direct honesty? Here it is. You walk in here acting like you know more than active Air Force Command personnel. You predict storms, generators, radar failures. He gestured toward the room. Everybody starts treating you like some kind of legend. Ethan's voice sharpened slightly. So what was your rank, sir? The question landed hard in the silence. Rain battered the windows. Static crackled overhead. Walter's eyes drifted briefly toward the massive dark runway outside before returning to Ethan. For a moment, nobody in the room moved. Then Walter answered quietly. Chief Master Sergeant. A couple officers exchanged glances immediately. One lieutenant gave a faint disappointed laugh. That is it. Ethan smirked slightly. You built all this mystery for enlisted rank? Walter nodded once. Yes. Some tension in the room eased instantly. A few officers relaxed. One captain muttered under his breath, thought we were about to hear retired general or something. Ethan gave a short laugh of relief. Well, there we go then. But Brooks did not laugh. Not even slightly. Ethan noticed that immediately. The master sergeant still looked deeply uncomfortable, his eyes fixed on Walter with growing concern. Ethan frowned faintly. What? Brooks hesitated. Walter calmly reached down and adjusted the old duffel bag beside his boots. As the worn fabric shifted beneath the fluorescent lights, something became visible near the side pocket. A faded black patch. Almost completely worn smooth with age. But one line of stitching remained barely visible beneath decades of frayed thread. Strategic Air Command. Brooks's face lost color again. Ethan saw it happen. Then Walter spoke one final sentence in the same calm gravel voice that somehow carried heavier than shouting ever could. Strategic Air Command, he said softly. Special Operations Air Mobility Division. The room went completely silent. No one in the briefing hall moved after the words left Walter Hayes's mouth. Strategic Air Command. Special Operations Air Mobility Division. The title settled over the room heavier than the storm pounding the base outside. Most of the younger officers barely understood why the phrase mattered. Strategic Air Command had been history book material for them. Old Cold War documentaries. Grainy footage played during academy lectures nobody paid attention to. But Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks understood exactly what he had just heard, and the look in his eyes said more than any explanation could. Captain Ethan Cole noticed it immediately. What? Ethan asked sharply. What is everybody suddenly so tense about? Brooks hesitated for half a second too long. That hesitation alone made the atmosphere worse. One lieutenant near the back of the room gave an uncertain laugh. Come on, it is not classified anymore, right? Another officer shrugged. My grandfather probably served in SAC too. Walter remained perfectly still through all of it. Rainwater slid down the windows behind him while lightning flashed across the soaked runway outside, briefly illuminating the parked aircraft in hard white bursts. Ethan folded his arms tighter. Look, he said, forcing a casual tone back into the room, with all due respect, Chief Master Sergeant is still enlisted rank. Walter nodded once. That is correct. Ethan gave a short smile. So why does everybody suddenly look like they saw a ghost? Brooks finally stepped forward. Captain, maybe we should move on from this. Ethan turned toward him immediately. No. Now I really want to know. He looked back at Walter. Special Operations Air Mobility Division doing what exactly? Walter's eyes drifted briefly toward the storm monitor on the far wall. Transport. One lieutenant snorted softly. Transport. Another officer chuckled under his breath. So basically cargo flights. Walter did not react to the mockery. That somehow made it worse. Ethan walked closer until he stood directly beside the old duffel bag resting near Walter's boots. The faded black patch stitched along the side pocket caught his eye again beneath the fluorescent lights. Most of the lettering had worn away after decades of use, but beneath the frayed thread sat a strange symbol stitched in dull gray. A raven with outstretched wings. Ethan frowned slightly. What is that? Walter glanced down once. Old patch. Ethan crouched slightly, studying it with growing curiosity. Never seen that unit before. Brooks's expression tightened instantly. Captain. Ethan ignored him. What was the call sign? Walter stayed silent. Ethan smirked faintly. Come on. Every old operation had one. No answer. Another officer stepped closer now, curiosity slowly overpowering caution throughout the room. Maybe it was something dramatic, the lieutenant joked. Like Nighthawk or Iron Eagle. A few uneasy laughs spread again. Ethan reached toward the side of the duffel bag. Mind if I see it? Brooks moved immediately. Do not touch that bag. His voice cracked through the room hard enough to stop everyone cold. Ethan straightened slowly. Master Sergeant, relax. Brooks's jaw flexed tightly. I said do not touch it. The sharpness in his tone stunned the room into silence. Ethan stared at him for a long moment before looking back down at Walter. The old man remained calm, almost tired, beneath the flickering fluorescent lights. Finally Walter spoke quietly. It is all right. Brooks looked genuinely uncomfortable now. Sir, with respect, Walter lifted one hand slightly. That was enough. Brooks stopped talking immediately. Ethan noticed that too. The old man did not raise his voice. Did not order anyone around. Yet a senior non-commissioned officer obeyed him instantly without question. Ethan slowly reached down and lifted the edge of the weathered duffel flap. Inside sat neatly folded clothing, an old canteen, and beneath them a thick leather binder worn smooth with age. The room leaned closer almost unconsciously. Ethan pulled the binder free carefully. Dust drifted from the cracked leather cover under the harsh overhead lighting. Stamped faintly across the front were faded silver letters nearly erased by time. Raven Actual. Brooks closed his eyes briefly the second he saw it. Ethan frowned. What the hell is Raven Actual? Walter's gaze settled quietly on the old binder in Ethan's hands. For the first time all night, something shifted faintly behind his eyes. Not fear. Not anger. Memory. Thunder rolled low across the mountains outside while the fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. Then Walter spoke in a voice so calm it almost disappeared beneath the sound of the storm. It was the name they used, he said quietly, when they needed airplanes to go places that officially did not exist. The room went dead silent again. And somewhere deep in the building below them, another generator suddenly failed. The emergency lights switched on a second later, bathing the briefing hall in dim red illumination that made every face in the room look colder and older. Somewhere below the building, backup generators rumbled alive with uneven metallic groans while static continued hissing through the damaged speakers overhead. Rain hammered the roof in relentless waves. Nobody laughed anymore. Captain Ethan Cole slowly lowered the leather binder into his hands, his earlier confidence thinning beneath the strange pressure now filling the room. Raven Actual. The word sat heavily in his mind even though he did not fully understand why. Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks understood. Ethan could see it plainly in the older man's face. Brooks stared at the binder the way soldiers looked at folded flags and memorial walls. Carefully. Respectfully. almost cautiously. Walter Hayes remained seated beneath the red emergency lights, his weathered face calm and unreadable while the storm raged outside the windows behind him. Ethan cleared his throat. What exactly was Raven Actual? Walter's eyes rested briefly on the old leather binder before drifting toward the runway outside. Beyond the rain-streaked glass, blue taxiway lights shimmered across flooded pavement while grounded aircraft sat motionless under the storm. A transport unit, Walter said quietly. One lieutenant muttered under his breath, "You keep saying transport like it is supposed to sound mysterious." Walter nodded slightly. Most transport is not mysterious. Ethan studied him carefully now. The old man's calmness no longer felt ordinary. It felt earned. Like the silence belonged to someone who had spent decades carrying things nobody else could understand. Brooks stepped forward slowly. "Sir," he said quietly, "they probably have never heard of the Arctic Corridor missions." Ethan looked toward him immediately. "The what?" Brooks hesitated before answering. "Cold War emergency operations. Strategic Air Command maintained crews trained to move personnel and equipment through severe atmospheric interference zones." One young officer frowned. "You mean storms?" Brooks shook his head slowly. "Not storms like this." Walter's gaze remained fixed on the runway lights outside. For several seconds, the only sounds inside the hall were thunder, static, and the soft hum of failing electrical systems. Then Walter spoke again. "January 1968, he said quietly. "Northern Alaska. Wind chill 60 below. Visibility less than a quarter mile." The room unconsciously fell still around his voice. Even Ethan stopped moving. Walter's eyes seemed farther away now, focused on something none of them could see. One of the bombers lost navigation systems during a magnetic storm. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the rain-streaked windows in violent white for a brief instant. Walter continued calmly. "No radar guidance. No communication. Fuel dropping every minute." Ethan frowned slightly. "How did they land?" Walter gave the faintest shrug. "They did not know where the runway was." The room stayed silent. Walter's weathered hands rested loosely atop the old duffel bag while the emergency lights painted deep shadows across his lined face. "Everything inside the cockpit was failing," he continued. "Compass drift. Frozen hydraulics. Electrical interference strong enough to blind navigation equipment." One lieutenant crossed his arms uneasily. "So what happened?" Walter's eyes narrowed slightly, not intention but memory. "Somebody had to guide them down manually." Thunder rolled low across the base. The fluorescent lights flickered again beneath the red emergency system. Walter slowly looked down toward the faded Raven patch stitched along the duffel bag. That was Raven Actual. The room remained completely still now. Even the younger officers who barely understood military history could feel the weight hidden beneath the old man's voice. Ethan stared harder at Walter. For the first time since the lockdown began, he realized the old man never exaggerated anything. Every sentence came out flat. Controlled. Like facts carried too long to need drama anymore. Brooks spoke quietly beside him. "Those flights were classified for decades." Walter nodded once. "Most of the crews are gone now." The words landed softly but heavily. Rainwater streamed down the windows while another distant generator groaned somewhere beneath the building. Ethan glanced down at the binder again. Its cracked leather edges looked ancient beneath the emergency lights. "You flew those missions?" Walter looked toward him calmly. "Sometimes." Ethan blinked slowly. "Sometimes?" Walter leaned back slightly in the chair. "There were many flights." A sharp burst of static exploded from the communication speakers overhead before cutting into silence again. One of the technicians near the front desk cursed softly while trying to restore tower systems. Outside, lightning flashed again over the dark mountains surrounding Falcon Ridge Air Force Base. Ethan looked back toward Walter Hayes sitting quietly beneath the red emergency lights with the storm raging behind him, and for the first time all night he felt something unfamiliar creeping beneath his confidence. Not fear. Perspective. Because suddenly the old man no longer looked small at all. The storm intensified just after midnight. Wind slammed against the reinforced glass hard enough to make the entire briefing hall tremble in low rhythmic vibrations. Emergency lights painted the room in deep crimson shadows while technicians struggled across flickering consoles trying to stabilize communication systems. Outside, the runway had nearly disappeared beneath sheets of rain and rolling ground fog. Falcon Ridge Air Force Base no longer felt like a modern military installation. It felt stranded. Cut off from the rest of the world somewhere beneath the storm. Captain Ethan Cole stood near the operations table staring down at the old leather binder. Still resting in his hands. Raven Actual. The name would not leave his head. Around him, the room had changed completely. The younger officers no longer joked or smirked toward Walter Hayes. Most avoided looking directly at him now. The old man remained seated quietly beneath the dim red emergency lights, hands folded loosely across the worn duffel bag at his feet, watching the storm outside with the same calm expression he had worn all night. Ethan finally looked toward Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks. "You knew who he was the second you walked in." Brooks hesitated. "Not exactly." Ethan frowned. "Then why are you acting like this?" Brooks glanced toward Walter briefly before lowering his voice. "Because there are names you only hear from old commanders." The tension in his voice made Ethan uneasy again. Nearby, one of the communications specialists suddenly cursed under his breath. "We just lost long-range tower feed completely." Another technician spun toward the room. "Weather Command says the magnetic interference is spreading faster than projected." Walter spoke without turning around. "It will hit the eastern array next." One lieutenant muttered softly, "How does he keep doing that?" Nobody answered. Brooks quietly stepped away from the room's center and pulled a secured tablet from his soaked flight jacket. Ethan noticed immediately. "What are you doing?" Brooks ignored the question at first, tapping rapidly through military archive menus while static crackled overhead. The emergency lights flickered again. Thunder rolled across the mountains so deeply the floor itself seemed to vibrate beneath their boots. Finally Brooks stopped typing. His face tightened instantly. Ethan walked closer. "What?" Brooks stared at the screen silently for several long seconds before turning the tablet slightly away from the others. Ethan caught only fragments before the display dimmed. Department of Defense Archive access restricted. Operational status sealed. Clearance level crimson. Ethan blinked hard. What the hell is crimson clearance? Brooks swallowed once. It means somebody buried the file very deep. Ethan stared toward Walter again. The old man still had not moved. From the chair near the windows. Rainwater streamed behind him in endless silver streaks while lightning flashed across the dark runway outside. He looked less like a retired enlisted man now and more like a monument everyone had accidentally overlooked. Brooks stepped farther toward the back corner of the hall, lowering his voice even more as he reopened the archive search. Ethan followed him immediately. "Master Sergeant." Brooks finally stopped and looked directly at him. "Captain, listen carefully to me." His voice had lost every trace of casual military professionalism. "Do not embarrass yourself any further tonight." Ethan frowned. "You still have not told me who he is." Brooks exhaled slowly. "Because I am trying to figure out why he is here." The answer unsettled Ethan more than he expected. Another lightning flash illuminated the room in stark white. Brooks typed one final command into the tablet. Then suddenly the screen changed. An old black and white photograph appeared beneath layers of military archive warnings. Ethan leaned closer automatically. A massive cargo aircraft sat on a frozen runway surrounded by snow and darkness. Standing near the lowered ramp was a much younger Walter Hayes wearing a heavy flight jacket beneath Arctic winds. Beside him stood several officers. One of them wore 4 stars on his collar. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Who is that general?" Brooks stared silently at the image. "That," he said quietly, "became General Raymond Mercer." Ethan's expression shifted immediately. Everyone in the Air Force knew Mercer. Commander of Air Mobility Operations. Decorated pilot. Living legend. Brooks zoomed further into the old photograph. Beneath it sat a faded operational note. Emergency Arctic extraction. Aircraft survival probability, less than 12%. Mission completed successfully under guidance of Chief Master Sergeant Walter Hayes. Ethan read the line twice. Then a third time. The room suddenly felt much colder around him. Brooks slowly lowered the tablet. "General Mercer never talks about those missions publicly," he said quietly. "But old commanders still mention one name sometimes." Ethan swallowed. "Raven Actual." Brooks nodded once. "The man who brought aircraft home when navigation failed." Across the room, Walter Hayes remained seated beneath the emergency lights watching the storm beyond the glass while the entire base slowly unraveled around him. And for the first time all night, Captain Ethan Cole began realizing the old man had never been trapped in the storm with them. They were trapped in it with him. The storm reached critical status at 12:37 in the morning. Falcon Ridge Air Force Base disappeared almost entirely beneath black rain clouds and violent electrical interference that swallowed radar coverage across 3 surrounding sectors. Inside the operations hall, emergency crews moved faster now, voices sharper, faces tighter beneath the dim red lighting. Every few seconds another warning tone echoed through the building followed by bursts of static across damaged communication channels. Yet through all of it, Walter Hayes remained seated near the rain-streaked windows with the same calm stillness that had unsettled the room from the beginning. Captain Ethan Cole could not stop looking at him now. Not after the photograph. Not after the archive file. The old man no longer resembled the harmless retired veteran Ethan had mocked earlier that night. He looked like someone history had hidden on purpose. Ethan slowly approached again while Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks remained near the secured tablet, quietly typing through restricted military databases. Why would General Mercer know him personally? Ethan asked softly. Brooks did not look up. Because Mercer flew under him once. Ethan frowned hard. Under him? He was enlisted. Brooks finally lifted his eyes. Captain, there are ranks on paper. He glanced toward Walter. And then there are people everybody listens to when things stop working. The answer settled heavily in Ethan's chest. Across the room, several younger officers now spoke in low whispers while occasionally glancing toward Walter with growing uncertainty. The arrogance from earlier had evaporated completely. Nobody laughed anymore. Outside, lightning split across the mountains in violent white veins, illuminating the soaked runway and grounded aircraft for brief terrifying seconds before darkness swallowed them again. Suddenly one of the communication officers straightened sharply at his console. Sir, we just regained partial satellite relay. Another technician turned immediately. Can you reach Air Mobility Command? Fingers moved rapidly across keyboards. Static crackled. Then the young operator looked up. Weak signal only. Brooks stepped forward instantly. Patch me through. Ethan watched him carefully now. The Master Sergeant's professionalism had sharpened into something almost urgent. Moments later a broken voice pushed through the speaker system beneath layers of interference. Air Mobility Command Operations Center. Brooks identified himself quickly. This is Falcon Ridge Emergency Operations. I need immediate confirmation on retired personnel file Walter Hayes. Silence crackled across the line for 2 long seconds. Then the voice returned, noticeably different now. More alert. Repeat the name. Brooks glanced toward Walter before answering carefully. Chief Master Sergeant Walter Hayes. Another pause. Longer this time. Ethan felt the entire room unconsciously listening. Then the distant operator spoke again. Stand by. Static swallowed the line. Rain hammered the building so violently it sounded like gravel thrown against steel. Nobody moved. Walter remained seated near the windows watching the storm. 30 seconds passed. Then the communication speaker crackled alive so suddenly several officers jumped. A new voice filled the room. Older. Sharper. Command authority wrapped inside every word. Who requested confirmation on Hayes? Brooks immediately straightened. Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks, sir. Ethan noticed the shift instantly. Brooks sounded different now. More formal than at any point that night. Master Sergeant, the voice continued, why are you accessing Raven actual records from Falcon Ridge? Ethan's pulse quickened. The room had gone completely silent again. Brooks answered carefully. Sir, Chief Master Sergeant Hayes is physically present on base during the storm lockdown. Silence. Total silence. Even the static seemed to fade. Then came one single sentence spoken low enough to chill the entire room. Walter Hayes is there. The voice no longer sounded irritated. It sounded stunned. Ethan looked toward Brooks sharply. Brooks swallowed once. Yes, sir. Somewhere far down the communication chain, muffled voices suddenly erupted. Orders. Movement. Phones ringing. The speaker hissed with interference before the voice returned, harder now. Listen carefully. Nobody disrespects that man again. Do you understand me? Brooks answered immediately. Yes, sir. Ethan stared openly now while several officers exchanged stunned looks around the room. The voice continued. General Mercer is being informed immediately. That sentence hit the room like a physical force. One lieutenant actually took a small step backward. Everyone in Air Mobility Command knew General Raymond Mercer. 4-star command authority. One of the most respected pilots alive. The speaker crackled again. Keep Hayes there. Brooks blinked. Sir. That is a direct order. Then the line went dead. Static filled the hall once more beneath the howl of the storm outside. Nobody spoke afterward. Captain Ethan Cole slowly turned toward Walter Hayes sitting quietly beneath the emergency lights while rain streamed behind him across the dark glass. The old man looked exactly the same as he had hours earlier. Same faded denim jacket. Same weathered hands resting calmly atop the old duffel bag. Same quiet eyes reflecting the storm beyond the runway. But now the entire room looked at him differently. Because somewhere beyond the blackout and interference and storm-choked skies, a 4-star general had just heard his name and reacted like the past itself had suddenly come back to life. The atmosphere inside Falcon Ridge Air Force Base changed completely after the transmission ended. Nobody returned to casual conversation. Nobody laughed. The operations hall had become unnaturally quiet beneath the red emergency lighting and constant roar of the storm outside. Rain battered the reinforced windows so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel thrown against steel. Static hissed softly through damaged communication channels while technicians worked in tense silence at flickering consoles. And through all of it, Walter Hayes remained seated calmly near the back windows like the center of a storm nobody else understood. Captain Ethan Cole stood motionless near the operations table staring toward the old man with a completely different expression now. Hours earlier he had seen a confused retiree wandering into a restricted briefing hall. Now every instinct in the room seemed to revolve around Walter Hayes without him saying more than a few quiet sentences at a time. Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks suddenly straightened at the communications desk. We have incoming command traffic. Every head turned instantly. The speakers crackled beneath layers of interference before a sharp voice filled the room. Falcon Ridge operations, stand by for priority arrival. Ethan frowned. Arrival? Another burst of static followed. General Raymond Mercer is en route to your location. The room froze. One lieutenant blinked in disbelief. In this storm? Brooks looked equally stunned. That is impossible. All aircraft are grounded. The speaker hissed again. General Mercer overrode grounding protocol 20 minutes ago. Ethan stared toward the dark rain-swept runway outside. Nobody overrode storm lockdown at Falcon Ridge. Not during magnetic interference severe enough to blind half the base. Unless they absolutely had to. Across the room, Walter finally looked away from the windows. Raymond always hated waiting. The quiet sentence landed harder than shouting ever could. Ethan slowly turned toward him. You call General Mercer Raymond? Walter gave the faintest shrug. That is his name. Nobody knew how to respond to that. Thunder rolled across the mountains so deeply the floor beneath them vibrated. Then somewhere outside beyond the blackout and rain came a distant sound cutting through the storm. Rotor blades. Every officer in the room looked toward the windows instantly. At first there was nothing but darkness and rain. Then slowly, through the sheets of water beyond the runway lights, a pair of white landing beams appeared descending through the storm clouds. A helicopter. One lieutenant whispered under his breath, no way. The aircraft emerged fully seconds later, fighting brutal crosswinds while rain whipped violently around the spinning rotor wash. Emergency crews outside immediately rushed into motion beneath flashing amber lights as the helicopter settled toward the soaked landing pad near the operations building. Ethan could barely believe what he was seeing. He actually came. Brooks answered quietly without taking his eyes off the aircraft. I do not think he had a choice. The helicopter touched down hard against the storm while rotor wash blasted rainwater across the tarmac in massive silver waves. Inside the hall, officers instinctively straightened uniforms and adjusted posture as tension swept through the room like electricity. Moments later the emergency doors burst open beneath a howl of wind and rain. Security personnel entered first. Then General Raymond Mercer stepped inside Falcon Ridge operations wearing a soaked flight jacket beneath 4 stars glinting beneath the red emergency lights. Even at 60 years old, Mercer carried the sharp controlled presence of a man accustomed to command at every level. The room snapped to attention instantly. At ease, Mercer said immediately, already walking forward. But he was not looking at the officers. He was looking past them. Toward Walter Hayes. The entire room watched in complete silence as the 4-star general crossed the operations hall through flickering emergency lights and static-filled air without acknowledging anyone else present. Ethan felt his heartbeat hammering inside his chest. Mercer stopped directly in front of Walter. For one long second, neither man spoke. Rain streamed down the windows behind them while thunder rolled outside across the mountains. Then General Raymond Mercer slowly raised his hand in salute. A full formal salute. To a retired enlisted man sitting quietly in a faded denim jacket. The room stopped breathing. Walter looked up at him calmly before returning the salute with slow-weathered precision. Mercer lowered his hand first. His voice, when it finally came, sounded quieter than anyone expected. Good to see you again, Chief. Walter gave a faint tired smile. You got old, Raymond. A few officers looked physically stunned hearing the exchange. Mercer almost smiled back. Took me long enough to catch up to you. Then the general turned slowly toward the room. His expression hardened immediately. Every officer standing here tonight, he said, owes this man more respect than you understand. Nobody moved. Nobody even blinked. Mercer looked toward Ethan Cole directly. Not angry. Worse than angry. Disappointed. Chief Master Sergeant Walter Hayes flew missions your generation was never cleared to read about. The general's voice remained steady beneath the storm and static surrounding them. When navigation systems failed, pilots listened to him. When aircraft disappeared in weather nobody else would enter, he brought them home. Mercer glanced back toward Walter briefly. There are people alive today because this man refused to lose them. Silence swallowed the room completely. And for the first time all night, Captain Ethan Cole finally understood why everyone who recognized Walter Hayes reacted the same way. Not fear. Reverence. The storm finally began breaking apart just before dawn. After hours of violent rain and electrical interference, the black clouds over Falcon Ridge Air Force Base slowly started drifting east across the mountains, leaving streaks of pale gray light spreading across the horizon beyond the runway. Inside the operations hall, the emergency lights still glowed dim red against exhausted faces and flickering consoles, but the tension that had gripped the room all night had changed into something quieter now. Heavier. General Raymond Mercer stood near the rain-streaked windows speaking softly with Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks while technicians gradually restored communication systems one by one. Outside, ground crews moved carefully across soaked tarmac beneath rotating amber lights as the base slowly came back to life. Yet the center of the room remained exactly where it had been all night. Walter Hayes still sat calmly beside the windows with the old olive drab duffel bag resting near his boots. The same faded denim jacket. The same weathered hands folded loosely together. The same quiet stillness that somehow carried more authority than every rank in the building combined. Captain Ethan Cole stood several feet away watching him in silence. The humiliation from earlier in the night replayed through his mind with painful clarity now. The jokes. The sarcasm. The mocking questions about retirement homes and weather forecasts. Ethan felt his stomach tighten harder every time he remembered the look on Walter's face through all of it. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Patience. The kind only men with real experience ever seemed to carry. Mercer finally approached Walter again while the room unconsciously fell silent around them. Weather Command says the interference field is collapsing, the general said quietly. Walter nodded once. Told you the storm would turn north before sunrise. Mercer gave a faint tired smile. You were right again. A few nearby officers exchanged glances. Even now, hearing a four-star general casually accepting the old man's judgment felt surreal. Walter slowly leaned forward and reached for the old duffel bag at his feet. The movement instantly drew every eye in the room. Ethan watched as Walter carefully lifted the weathered strap over one shoulder with slow deliberate motions shaped by age and old injuries. Mercer noticed immediately. You are leaving already? Walter looked toward the brightening runway outside. Storm is over. Mercer frowned slightly. You could stay. We have guest quarters prepared. Walter shook his head once. Never liked staying on bases too long. There was no bitterness in the statement. Just quiet truth. Ethan swallowed hard before finally stepping forward. Chief. Walter paused and looked toward him calmly. For a second Ethan forgot everything he planned to say. The room watched silently behind him. General Mercer said nothing. Brooks said nothing. The only sound was the distant hum of generators and rainwater dripping somewhere beyond the operations floor. Ethan straightened slightly. I owe you an apology. Walter studied him quietly. Ethan forced himself to continue. I thought, he hesitated. I thought you were just some confused old man who wandered into the wrong building. Walter's expression never changed. Ethan lowered his eyes. Briefly. I was wrong. Several long seconds passed. Then Walter gave the faintest nod. Most people are. The answer hit Ethan harder than anger would have. Because there was no resentment in it. No need to humiliate him back. Just calm acceptance shaped by decades of being underestimated. Mercer glanced toward Ethan. You know why men like him matter, Captain? Ethan looked toward the general. Mercer's voice softened slightly beneath the low hum of the operations hall. Because when everything stopped working, everybody listened to Walter Hayes. The room remained silent. Walter adjusted the strap of the duffel bag on his shoulder before turning slowly toward the exit doors. Officers instinctively stepped aside as he began walking across the hall. Nobody ordered them to move. They simply did. Ethan noticed that too. Respect had replaced rank entirely. Walter passed beneath the fading red emergency lights while dawn slowly brightened the rain-streaked windows behind him. Just before reaching the doors, he stopped and glanced back once toward the operations floor filled with officers, technicians, and command personnel still watching him. His pale blue eyes drifted briefly toward Ethan. "Captain." Ethan straightened immediately. Walter's voice remained calm and gravel-soft. The loudest people in the room usually know the least about storms. Then he continued walking. The doors opened with a soft hydraulic hiss as cold morning air rolled into the operations hall carrying the scent of rain, jet fuel, and wet concrete. Outside, the storm clouds were finally breaking apart above Falcon Ridge Air Force Base while the first thin strip of sunlight touched the soaked runway. Walter Hayes disappeared into the dawn without another word. And behind him, inside the silent operations hall, nobody laughed anymore. Because some men do not need to remind the world who they were. The people who survived because of them remember well enough.